Great. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Totnes Talks event, which promises to be a really fascinating evening. And you might just use the chat function now, just for a minute or so, just to let everybody know, just so we can see who you are, where you're joining us from. It's really nice just to get a snapshot of who's here with us this evening. The chat box down at the bottom. So yeah, do chip in. Massimo's here from South Brent. Do fill the chat box with your introductions and any groups or organizations that you're representing. Rowan in South Brent, welcome. Charlie from Schumacher College, Jeannie on Dartmoor, Joe in South Brent, Chris from Totnes, Guy from TTT, Jane from South Ham, Sustainable South Hams, Father Jim from the Totnes Rectory, Hayden from South Brent, David and Warren from Totnes, Anne in Minehead, all the way over there. Isabel, hi, in Totnes, Fiona in Totnes, Judy from Plymouth joining us, Chris and Tim from Dartington Village, Juliet from Totnes, Richard O'Connell, hi Richard from Totnes Trust, Amanda and Chad in Dartington, hiya. Erica in Dartington, Patty in Totnes. We're joined by Andrea from Paignton, Emma in Totnes, Ruth from Ashburton. Scotland is our furthest away so far, I think. And anyway, so 2 people from Scotland. So you're all most welcome. Delighted to have you all here with us this evening. And so this evening is a shared reflection with some brilliant guest speakers on the recent COP26 talks in Glasgow. And as Jim said, we're sorry we're not doing this actually in person, but a quick look at the growth curve of COVID cases in Totnes right now makes it feel like an increasingly sensible option to do this online at this time. So COP may already feel a little bit like it was quite a long time ago. I'm up to my neck now in preparing the case for a compulsory purchase order of the for the Atmos project in Totnes. So my finger muscle memory has moved from COP to CPO. So every time I try and write about COP, I find myself writing COP26. But what happened in Glasgow and what didn't happen in Glasgow are still of the utmost importance. It was, as many people said at the time, the last COP really that matters. And whether you were in the city as part of the talks, in the green zone, in the blue zone, or out on the streets, or whether you were in Totnes and taking part in the COPNES events that were put on here, or following it online, wherever you were, this evening is for you to deepen your understanding of what happened and what it all means. And Christiana Figueres, in an article writing about COP, wrote that it was a city of 2 tales, given that the gulf between the formal process and the civil society outside felt much wider than it did in Paris. And you'll no doubt arrive at this meeting somewhere along a continuum from it was a total failure to it was as good as it could have been, and 1.5 degrees is still alive just about. And all positions along that spectrum are welcome here tonight. And one could argue that regardless of what happened at COP, the tide is moving rapidly away from fossil fuels. In the weeks since COP26, Iceland has announced an end to oil exploration. Shell has pulled out of the UK Cambo oil field. Norway has announced that it will not grant new oil exploration licenses in virgin or little explored areas. China has stopped backing African coal. The incoming German administration has signaled a big shift in the approach of the world's 4th largest economy towards climate. Australia is opening up offshore wind. Portugal has closed its last coal plant, and Nigeria has become the first major developing nation to set a carbon budget. Is it enough? Of course not. Might we be at a tipping point, or is that wishful thinking? What happened at COP? What does it all mean? That's why we're here for this evening. So I must just start this evening by thanking a wide range of support from different organizations who made this whole series of events possible. Totnes Talks, the Totnes Climate Change Response Centre, Transition Town Totnes, Extinction Rebellion, Totnes Renewable Energy Society, St Mary's and St John's Churches, the Devon Wildlife Trust, Bridgetown Alive, South Hams Climate Action Network, Torbay and South Devon RSPB, Crazy Beautiful World Youth Project, Sustainable Staverton, Sustainable Little Hempston, New Futures Academy, and the Totnes WI. Thank you all. A movement of movements indeed. So what we're going to do this evening is first to hear from our two main speakers, and then we'll hear from what we're calling our discussants, or perhaps we might call them our provocateurs. Anyway, we'll hear their thoughts, and then we'll have a Q&A time with your thoughts and questions and reflections, which hopefully that all sounds okay and something to look forward to. So I'm going to first introduce our two speakers, and then I'm going to ask our discussants to introduce themselves. So we have Dan Lunt and Tom Carnack with us. Dan Lunt is Professor of Climate Science at Bristol University. His main area of research is past climate change and what it can tell us about the future. He was a lead author on the IPCC's for the IPCC. His particular focus was the science addressing the Earth's energy budget, climate feedbacks, and climate sensitivity. He works with the Bristol Research Initiative for the Dynamic Global Environment, where a multidisciplinary team researched the complex interactions between all the Earth's components, the oceans, the atmosphere, the ice sheets, the biosphere, analyzing the influence of human activity on global change and assessing impacts on future climate changes on all aspects of society. Dan, give us a hi.
Hi, thanks very much, Rob, for that very nice introduction. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to this evening, in particular to the discussion.
Great, thank you very much. And Tom, who lives just up there, was a senior advisor to Christiana Figueres in her role as executive secretary to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, with a focus on the political strategy towards achieving binding international agreements. So he was a key mover for the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. He writes on climate policy and is co-author with Christiana Figueres, who we mentioned earlier, of The Future We Choose, Surviving the Climate Crisis, subtitled as A Stubborn Optimist's Guide to the Climate Crisis. And with Christiana and with Paul Dixon, he co-runs the blog Global Optimism, which takes you behind the scenes of politics, investments, and actions that are meeting the climate crisis head on, and also does the wonderful Outrage and Optimism podcast. Tom, give us a hello, and nice to see you.
Thanks, Rob. Lovely to see you. Lovely to be here, everybody. I have recently managed to make it back to living in Totnes after 20 years of trying, so I'm very sad we're not all together, but maybe next time.
We're delighted to have you back, Tom. And so, Alana, could you just introduce yourself?
Hi, folks. I'm Alana. I am here kind of representing the Living Projects. We're a land-based organisation founded by young people for young people. We're on 4 acres on the edge of Dartington in Totnes. And we deal with a range of different issues, from land access to food security, social health, well-being, rural infrastructure for youth. Our list is endless. And yeah, I'm here kind of representing that project and all of the amazing people that are involved with it, and the kind of local community-based responses to the climate and ecological emergency.
Fabulous. Thank you, Alana, so much. So to move from one fantastic transformative local project to another, Chantel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, yes, I'm Chantel Norton. I'm a director at Food in Community. We're a not-for-profit, and we collect sustainably, ethically produced food, which is surplus from farms, orchards and other producers. And we use this food to help people in distress and to strengthen the community bonds. So a lot of it goes to charity as well. My background is I'm a postdoctoral biologist, and I've spent a lot of time working on treatments for HIV, hepatitis and respiratory diseases. But in parallel, at weekends, I worked with the family catering business, and I'm a keen cook. So food is kind of where I'm at, really. But I've lived most of my adult life with some degree of climate anxiety. I was the president of the Imperial College Environmental Society way back in 1993, and I volunteered at various environmental causes since then. But about 5 years ago, I decided to dedicate more of my time to work at the grassroots, with a focus on finding solutions that are people-centered and inclusive, as well as being kind of scientifically sound. So my main personal interests, are around tackling food poverty and citizen empowerment, agroecological systems and in tackling food waste as well. Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you, Chantal. And just up the road, just over there in Staverton is Simon. Simon, would you like to say hello?
Good evening, and thanks for having me back. I work with 0 Hour, which is the campaign for the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill. By passing the bill, the government will be making a legally binding pledge to follow the science in tackling the climate and nature crisis. Now, some say the UK is doing well and others like China are much worse. So why is this needed? Well, the IPCC told us that we need rapid and far-reaching transitions across all sectors. But you only have to look around you and there's little sign of any sort of radical change in this country. Very little progress has been made in areas like homes, transport, agriculture, and scientists are warning that the UK is heading seriously off track. Now, I do acknowledge that we've come a long way and we can't always complain. We have to look at the positive angle, but we've also got to be honest about the task ahead of us, in my view. And the best way that we can influence the world is to get our own house in order. But there's a big gap between what's needed and what's actually happening. In fact, I see it as two gaps. There's the gap between the UK's net zero by 2050 plan and action on the ground, the sort of delivery gap. The CCC, the Climate Change Committee, said that credible policies only cover about 1/5 of the emissions cuts needed to meet our targets. But then there's the gap between the government's plan and what's really needed if we're going to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And I don't think there's enough focus on this. And that's in part because it's so hellishly complicated. 368 pages of technical jargon in the latest net zero report. How are the electorate supposed to know it does what it says on the tin, limit warming to 1.5 degrees? And spoiler alert, it really doesn't. So this is why we need the CEE bill. The legally binding nature of the bill means the government will be obligated to produce a plan that actually works. And people and businesses can rely on the certainty that creates. And then we can really get to work on transforming the economy, cleaning the air, creating hundreds of thousands of new jobs and providing hope. And we all need a bit of hope.
We do indeed.
Thanks.
Beautiful. Thank you, Simon. And last but not least, Jackie Hodgson. Give us a hello and an introduction.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me this evening. I have the somewhat strange position of being probably the only one that's got political motivations sitting on this panel, but I hasten to add that I'm actually really, I've gone into politics, such as it is at town, district and county level, simply because for years I worked in with Friends of the Earth, people like this. I worked with Transition, I worked with local Agenda 21 organisations, and there was always a need to have somebody on the inside that didn't just kind of vote when you persuaded them and gave them lots of cups of tea and goodness knows what, but actually really got it. And so my background as a sort of an eco advocate for all my professional life has actually put me in a really good position. It means that I'm constantly the one that gets sort of sat on and squashed at meetings, and not least of which was last Thursday when my divestment motion at county got squashed yet again. But it actually means that I think it hopefully gives other people encouragement to come forward, because I've gone from being the only Green on Devon County Council to be two of us now. Okay, it's taken 4 years to get there. But I think this is where we need to get people moving into the recognition that politics is, and the decision making that goes on is the place that we need a lot of people to move into. People like us that are here this evening, not the people that are kind of just in there, I would say for a lot of the time, the wrong reasons, or as advocates for just the kind of those who want to make a lot of money out of the system and milk the planet dry. I've been involved in the COP26 in Totnes, and I think that was a real joy. I've been involved in the climate emergency action work that's been going on in the town since 2018. And it was myself that put the declarations on Town Council, Southampton District Council and Devon County Council. And interestingly, Totnes embraced it within 3 days. District Council took 6 months and Devon County Council took about 4 months, but the outcomes were slightly different, including that Devon County Council thought 2050 was quite early enough to worry about all of that. But it's, I think, getting involved across those boundaries is actually really interesting, because I've got the privilege of knowing a lot of the people that are here tonight, a lot of the organisations that are here. For 25 years, I ran an organic smallholding in Ireland. So it's all that background gives me the strength to know that just the various dimensions under which all of this happens, and hopefully gives me some kind of power to my elbow to push for change, push for real change and understand the issues. I mean, it's sometimes a bit of a challenge, but I think it's really important. And just to give a little bit of a personal touch, I do enjoy a good joke.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you very much. So we're going to go to Dan. Dan, the floor is yours. You have, we've got 15 minutes and we'd love to hear your thoughts on our topic. Over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Let me just see if I can share my screen. So hopefully you can see that. And so, yeah, I'm going to talk about some reflections on COP26, but I'll start off with a bit of a brief introduction to, well, part of my day job, if you like, which is as a scientist on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So I'll just introduce that work very briefly before going on to talk about some reflections on COP. So first of all, just so really this is just by way of introduction really to say who I am. I'm a climate scientist at the University of Bristol, but I have been working at least part of my time for the last 2 or 3 years on the IPCC. So as I'm sure you all know, the IPCC is a UN body for assessing science related to climate change. It started off in 1988. It's now got 195 member states, and the bit that I'm involved in is the physical climate basis. So not really talking about mitigation or adaptation, but really focusing on the science of climate change. And that, you know, the reason that well, what I've been involved in a lot recently is because the most recent report was released at the beginning of August. Just to give you a feeling for how long that took, it was 7 years since the previous report in 2014. And this report itself that came out in August, we had 234 authors altogether from 66 countries. You can see these other stats here, but the reason for showing these stats really is to say that the IPCC report is not something that is just the viewpoint of a few isolated scientists. It really is a community document that comes out of scientific consensus. Every one of those authors basically has to sign on to everything that is said in that report. We don't do any new science ourselves. We assess published literature, so it's sort of an up-to-date assessment, but we don't do new work. And as a document itself, it is reviewed by other scientists. It's also reviewed by governments. And as such, there is governmental buy-in into the process and into the document itself. So it's sort of rather unique. It's a scientific document in that it's a collaboration between science and policymakers. And just to sort of remind you of some of the key outcomes that came out of this last report. First of all, it's a fact now that climate change is occurring everywhere on the planet. There is not a single person on this planet who is not affected by climate change in some way. And the change that we're seeing is now unprecedented in thousands of years. And actually, we're talking 120,000 years since climate was as warm as it is today. And also what we know, what is now a sort of unequivocal scientific fact, is that the warming that we've seen over the last few decades is human induced. There used to be statements that it was very likely or extremely likely. It is now sort of a scientific fact that climate change is human induced. We're seeing increases in extreme events. We know that if climate change increases, then the intensity and impacts of these extreme events is going to carry on increasing, including rainfall, droughts, heat waves. And the final sort of key message really is that if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change and keep below 1.5 degrees, then that will require immediate and wide-ranging cuts to emissions. So these were the main sort of summary points of the IPCC. And I wanted to put those up first, really, just to say, you know, this is the main thing what I do, and almost a caveat really to the next bit, which is to say I was at COP26 last month, but I was there very much as a scientist, not as a not as a policymaker or a lobbyist or what have you. So my view was very much, my view of the events and my understanding of the events was very much from the viewpoint of a climate scientist. And so I apologize, first of all, for all the things that I probably misunderstood that were going on, but just to say that this is, very much a personal reflection of my time there. I'm also in a, I thought it would be useful to give a bit of context to what was happening sort of in the build-up to COP and the negotiations that went on. So first of all, just to give some, like I say, to give some context, the Paris Agreement said to limit global warming above pre-industrial levels to 1.5 degrees, ideally, and preferably. But just to put that number in context, we've actually already had 1.1 degrees of warming. So we're, more than 2/3 of the way towards that limit that is enshrined in the Paris Agreement. So that's one of the things to bear in mind. The World Health Organization has said, thinking about future change, said that between 2030 and 2050, climate change is expected to cause approximately 250,000 additional deaths per year. And this is just from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress, not other sort of more indirect impacts of climate change. So just to give you a scale of what those numbers actually mean in terms of the actual impacts. The other thing, bit of context in the run up to COP, is that the reason why there's a COP meeting every year. Every 5 years is like a big one, because part of the Paris Agreement was that there would be this ratchet mechanism where countries had to pledge to increase their pledges, the ambition of their pledges every 5 years. So that's why this one was a particularly big one. Also, to put some context into the negotiations that were going on, at previous COPs, the global north, if you like, had agreed to provide climate finance to the poorest countries in the world, those least able to adapt to climate change, and they had promised 100 billion a year. But in fact, those targets have not been met. And so you can see that again is a sort of background to some of these discussions, is that those countries that were promised that climate finance haven't actually received it. A final bit of context to the negotiations is this graph here, which I think is one of the most powerful images that whenever I show this in a lecture, for example, to our students, there's quite a lot of shock, if you like. The top panel that I'm just showing now, the size of each country in the globe on this. I'm a geographer, so I love this sort of thing. But this is a map of the world where the size of each country is actually related to their cumulative emissions of carbon, over the last however many years. So you can see, for example, the huge size of the US, of the UK, in contrast to other countries in the global south. But the next plot I'm going to show is the same thing, but it's basically the size of each country relative to the impacts that they will feel from climate change in terms of deaths due to malaria, malnutrition, diarrhea, inland food-related fatalities. And you can see this just shows the injustice associated with climate change in terms of the countries that are causing the problem compared to the countries that are feeling the impacts. So this is, I think, this slide just shows sort of the context going into the negotiations. So a brief intro to COP itself. This is where it happened. There were you could argue there were 3 parts to COP. There was the COP on the streets, as Rob was talking about earlier, but then also in addition to that, there was the green zone, so-called green zone and the blue zone. The green zone was sort of more of a public outreach sort of space, and then the blue zone was where the negotiations were held in this building over here in the SEC. Give you a flavour of what it was like. Again, I'm a geographer. I like to know where I'm placed in space. So this is just a map of the actual conference zone. And this bit here was what we call the pavilions, where every country had it was almost like a trade fair, I guess. Each country brought along a fancy stand. It was almost like the fanciness of your pavilion was almost inversely proportional to your climate ambition, perhaps. It's like Saudi Arabia had an amazing stand. You know, where they celebrated their 10 wind farms or whatever. No, that's an exaggeration, but there was this area of sort of these pavilions where countries were sort of showing their showcasing their commitments. The UK also organised a space over here where there, throughout the 2 weeks, there were presentations by groups and very, you know, the great and the good, giving talks to an open audience of anyone who happened to be in the blue zone. In addition, there was this plenary room where, you know, the negotiations were going on effectively behind closed doors, but every so often, once in the first week, I think almost most days in the second week, the negotiations would suddenly sort of come out in the open, and in this plenary zone, there'd be effectively the countries' negotiations would speak, and this would be sort of the state of the nation in terms of the state of the negotiations. And Alok Sharma, who was leading it from the UK side, chaired that and would basically lay out the plan for the next day's negotiations. And then, like I said, over here with sort of the secret rooms where I didn't go into, I wasn't allowed into the negotiation rooms where actually the real business happened in terms of negotiations between individual countries. So that was going on. I thought, you know, these plenary events, like I said, were the only time really that I really experienced the negotiations themselves, but they were really quite powerful and emotional, in that there would be, like I said, a summary from Alok Sharma, and then in individual countries talking on behalf of different negotiating coalitions would give various speeches. So, for example, as we went round, we had this was from the penultimate day of the negotiation. So this is when everything's coming to a head, and I sort of put together a sort of an on-running commentary, if you like, of what was going on. The Kenyan negotiator said, as I was arriving to the meeting today, I walked by a placard. It read, "If you want to know about climate change, ask your child. We have not inherited the earth from our forefathers, we have borrowed it. The youth has given us a last chance." I won't read out all of these, but some of them really were very powerful. Marshall Islands, 1.5 is not negotiable, nor is the future of my children or yours. This is the crucial decade. From Ghana, the present generation has rented the world from the previous generation, and we must pass it on. This is a moral obligation. A clear roadmap for mitigation goals is needed. Finance is very, very critical. Developed countries must make good on their pledges. The Maldives, for example, we have listened to disagreements on commas and full stops. We did not cause the climate crisis. Our islands are eroding, and the salt water incurses further and further. We are losing families and friends. So these, you know, some of these were really incredibly powerful. Many of these, the people who spoke, like I said, were talking on behalf of these negotiating blocks, and so you end up with some really, you know, complicated situations, because this just shows this is just a diagram of these different negotiating blocks. You can see individual countries might be part of the small island development states and the G77 block and ALBA all at the same time. So you had these different interests and priorities. You know, some countries, you know, almost conflicted amongst themselves as to what main priorities were.
And just to say, you've got 2 minutes.
Oh, okay, right. I better speed up then. So I'll just skip over some of this. And I thought I'd just very quickly just say what I thought were the main achievements and failures, if you like, of COP. And so I won't read them all out, but there certainly were some achievements. So some people were predicting there would just be no agreement. And at some points in the negotiations, it looked like nothing would come out of this, but eventually something was signed. There was a lot of technical work that was done that was actually, you know, a lot of people said was a very major achievement, in that some of the regulations around carbon markets and reporting, etc., were finalized. This ratchet mechanism that I said right at the beginning, where countries have to increase their ambition every 5 years, was changed to being every year, so that countries have to come back next year to increase their pledges. There were commitments made. There were groups formed and statements made on some sort of side issues like methane, various different statements on forest loss, for example. There were pledges on finance for it to at least double adaptation finance. The fact that the finance for $100 billion per year had not been met was noted with deep regret. And another achievement perhaps was that the science of climate change was very much front and center. There was I didn't at all in the whole meeting, I did not hear a single person who was sort of putting forward a climate skeptic argument, if you like, or doubting the science of climate change. All the discussions really revolved around finance, who should pay for loss and damages. That was much of the discussion. In terms of failure, the main failure really was on the finance side. There are three types of climate finance that are crucial here. One is that, and these all really relate to, the poorest countries in the world. They need climate finance for adaptation, for example, paying for their own flood defenses. They need finance to help them transition their own energy production from fossil fuel intensive to renewable. But where the real, the crucial sticking point really is on the issue of loss and damage, which is basically paying compensation to them for damages already incurred or damages that can't be mitigated in the future. And basically the biggest sticking point comes because the richest countries in the world, my reading of it is effectively they are scared about handing over a blank check. And whereas there's the climate justice side of it saying, well, maybe that's what should be done.
Just one more minute, Dan.
Yeah, and then there are a few other sort of failures related to perhaps this last minute wording change related to fossil fuels. And also there's some analysis of saying that the pledges made at this COP are only really a drop in the ocean. But just very finally, on the very last slide, I did want to give my personal thoughts, if you like, around this. I suspect that after COP, no one is happy. I don't expect there is anyone who thinks it was entirely successful from any walk of life or from any country or any organization. So you could argue that that means it was a balanced agreement. I think 1.5 is, to coin a phrase, is just about still alive, but is certainly on intensive life support. One thing, we are now in a situation where the science is at such a point where we can hold the policymakers to account, and it no longer, we can actually test whether what is being said by the policymakers is just words, is just blah, 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 or how much progress is being made and what those pledges actually mean in terms of numbers, and to just put things into context, into sort of a quantitative context of how successful COP was or wasn't. This is a really nice graph, I think. It shows where we were as we go through, or where we were as we go through from 2020 to just before COP26 to COP26 as well. If you take into account how countries' commitments changed through time, then we were looking in 2020 just at the 2030 commitments at a warming of 2.6 degrees. Just before COP, it had come down to 2.4 because of the statements that had come out just before COP. Within COP, with the statements that were changed then, this came down to 2.3. If you also believe the governments and policymakers in their long-term commitments, what their promises of net zero by 2050 or 2070 or whatever it is, and add all those up, science is able to tell us that just before COP, we were at about 2 degrees then, if you include those commitments as well. And if you include the commitments made at COP, and you believe the governments in terms of their long-term commitments, then we're looking at a long-term warming currently of 1.8. If you believe the policymakers in terms of this ratchet mechanism of increasing the strength of their commitments year on year, then this number will begin to come down if that happens.
Thank you, Dan.
One very final thing, that if nothing else, COP certainly raised the issue of climate change in the public mind and in the political mind. This is just some analysis of various different news outlets, how the word climate change or global warming appeared, how many times it appeared. This here is COP. So it was this is in the UK. So in the UK newspapers, it was an unprecedented level of coverage in terms of climate change. And yeah, I'd just like to say that for this, for the things that I've talked about, I hugely benefited from these articles in Carbon Brief, which is, if you don't know, I'm sure many of you know about it already, but for those of you who don't, it's an awesome webpage that is an awesome organization with a very nice webpage, which is highly respected by climate scientists and policymakers alike. And if you are interested in more detail about what went on at COP and what the quantitative outcomes of that are, then it's a really good place to go. So thank you very much. I'm really looking forward to some discussions.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan. Much appreciated. That's fantastic. Tom, it would be fascinating to hear your perspective from being inside this process and any reflections on what Dan has shared with us. So Tom, over to you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rob, and thanks, Dan, as well. That was great. Probably no one is happy was actually the objective that we had when we were at the UNFCCC trying to negotiate the Paris Agreement, because a multilateral process with 196 countries is a very difficult thing to deliver. So it's interesting that you put that there. And actually what we used to say is the only people that we want to be happy are the scientists. So hopefully we'll get to that point at the end. Now, Dan's covered much of the substance around the outcome from COP. So I'm just going to talk a bit more about the politics and the political tone that I experienced going to Glasgow, and sort of really where do I think it goes next? And what are the opportunities that were opened up that weren't there before in Glasgow? But I'm just going to start. Christiana said that this is a city of two tales. And for anyone who's listened to our podcast, I sometimes struggle to delineate between where Christiana's perspectives end and mine begin. But I'd just like to start with a moment in the middle of the first week where I had this experience within 30 minutes of hearing two different leaders speak within half an hour of each other. And the first one was John Kerry, the Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. And he said, "We stand on the cusp of history. Future generations will look back at this moment as the moment at which we reached the turning point on the climate crisis." And within half an hour, Greta Thunberg stood up and she said, "COP26 has failed utterly. It is a celebration of corporate greenwash and has even watered down blah, blah, blah." Now, the interesting thing about those statements is they are clearly completely contradictory. And they are also, I would argue, both true. So I'm just going to unpick how they're both true and what that means for our strategy. And to do that, I just want to talk for a minute, and Dan has covered some of this already, but I just want to emphasize some of it. What Glasgow was supposed to achieve in the context of the process that it was a part of. Now, Paris set in motion a process that was intended to decarbonize the global economy by the middle of the century. The objective is to get to net zero by 2050. And it was very difficult to achieve the Paris Agreement. There have been multiple attempts to get something serious together, and they'd failed for many decades. And they'd failed for lots of reasons. But the principal one was because of fairness. Climate change is fundamentally unfair. As Dan demonstrated in those graphs, it's been caused by one group of people, and it's been inflicted on another group. And as a result of that, for years, developing countries would say to developed countries, "You caused this problem, and what's more, you said you'd sort it out in 1992, so go and do something serious about it and then come back and we'll talk about a global deal." And that was intellectually correct. And developed countries would say to developing countries, "The world's completely different now. We all need to come together with a shared commitment. Many of the emissions are now coming from China and India or other places. This is different." And for years, those arguments played themselves out on the floor of the UN. The way we got through that in the end was with a unique international mechanism that had never been used before in international law. And it was the combination of a long-term goal with a series of short-term targets that would ultimately get you towards the long-term goal. Dan already referenced it. It's known as the ratchet. So that's a little bit like me saying, I'm going to lose 2 stone in the next year. That's my long-term goal. And my short-term goal is to lose £1 this month. Now, the £1 doesn't keep me in line with losing 2 stone by the end of the year. But in my first month, I get up off the couch, I stop eating potato chips, I start running a bit more. And by the end of the first month, I can theoretically make a more ambitious commitment for the next 5-year target. That's how we thought about it in Paris, right? Actually, after 5 years, technology would have changed, the economics would have shifted, costs for renewables would have come down, younger people would have entered the electorate, we'd sadly be in a situation where the impacts were worse, so the political winds would have changed, and we would be able to get to a point where the short-term targets would be in line with the long-term goal. Now, coming out of Paris, we had, as I said, a long-term target to hit 1.5, but we were actually heading for nearly 4 degrees of warming. So the reason Glasgow was important is it's the first test of that ratchet, the first time that international mechanism to have a long-term goal with a series of nationally determined commitments to keep you in line with it had ever been tested. So the ultimate test initially is, did that work? So just to look at that for a moment, many countries did come back and make new commitments under the Paris Agreement. More than 100 did. When you add all of those up, it takes us down from where we were coming out of Paris to nearly 4 degrees, as Dan said, to closer to 2.5. If you also include the shared commitments that were released while we were actually together in Glasgow, so the commitment on methane, the significant forest commitment, what happened on coal, a couple of other things, and you assume that those commitments are additional to the national commitments, which is not clear, but if you make that assumption, we could be heading for a warming threshold as low as 1.8. Now, so far, so good, right? The additional piece, which Dan mentioned, was a recognition in the text that this doesn't yet go far enough and we're not heading for 1.5. So therefore, countries are required to come back, not in 5 years, but next year to try and close the gap down to 1.5. Beyond that, there was also statements that came out about increasing adaptation finance, for the first time referencing loss and damage, didn't go far enough. But honestly, if you go back to 2015, when we signed the Paris Agreement, and you imagine that this was the first step in the ratchet mechanism under that very complicated international treaty, we would absolutely have taken this as a first step. So in that context, actually, you can say that Glasgow is doing what it was intended to do. It's the next step on a long-term journey. It was never going to solve all things for all people for all time. That was always a fantasy. It's not the last COP that matters. Every COP is going to matter from now on in order to get us in line to where we need to be. However, Dan said multiple times, if you believe them, and this is where the rubber really meets the road. Because what you see in these commitments is those little words, if fully implemented. If these targets are fully implemented, then we will see the trajectory and the outcome that has been described. And if you look back at the history of that, it's really not very happy. For example, in Glasgow, there was this really quite impressive commitment that came out where 100 countries came together and they committed to end and reverse deforestation by 2030. If you look at it, it's a beautifully constructed commitment that involves most tropical forest countries and a whole range of others. Now, that was actually quite an impressive moment. I would argue one of the most impressive moments in COP. However, if you go back to 2014, the New York Declaration on Forests made an almost identical commitment, and deforestation rates have gone up by 43% in the intervening years between then and now. Likewise, the 100 billion, we're still at a point where we're saying, we're promising jam tomorrow on the 100 billion. We're not actually delivering on the finance that we need to at this moment. Because of that, and I would say one of the things that happened in Glasgow, and one of the things that really made it a city of two tales, is that there was a collective realization that went on in the streets and amongst activists and amongst people who've been watching this for a long time, that they were being issued with promises that were familiar and that they'd seen before. And there was this breakdown of trust that I've never seen before, to the point where the more ambitious the commitments that were coming out of the COP, the more skeptical and less sure that there was really authentic leadership going on inside the COP happened in the streets. And I personally found that very painful, because I worked very hard when I was in the UN to keep the community together so that the activists and those on the inside had a shared objective. I mean, my role in Paris was to try and make the agreement more ambitious and more likely. And if I had a problem with Saudi Arabia or with anyone else in the negotiations, I'd be straight on the phone to Greenpeace and I'd say, I need a protest in here now with banners and trumpets, and they'd be there and we'd partner on trying to make that kind of breakthrough. But now I would argue that trust has collapsed, and activists on the outside believe that people on the inside are not authentic, and people on the inside believe that activists on the outside are not realistic about what's required. That to me is a legacy from COP, and it's a real problem. I'm really worried about it. The other thing I would say about the commitments that I just pointed out is that they can kind of be made to look good on paper in the way that I just described. You know, it's the ratchet mechanism, it's kind of working. If you look at what's happening, we're getting a bit further, it's 2.4 or maybe it's 1.8. But if you just step back a minute and you look at the context of where we are, 2 years into this most decisive decade in human history where we need to reduce emissions by fully 50%, at a point where we are the generation responsible for whether or not we're going to have coral reefs and rainforests in 50 years or 500 years, it begins to look incredibly churlish and absurdly detailed that we're even arguing about these things, that actually we should be able to be big enough as humanity to stand back and do what is required of us at this moment. So net, I would say 1.5 is still alive, but it's far from guaranteed. The next 12 months are going to be absolutely crucial. This new 1 year ratchet is going to be really essential to demonstrate whether or not we can really deliver on it. If we don't see a trajectory shift in 12 months' time of pledges that are backed up with real laws, then I think we will see an even deeper collapse of trust between people who are and in different parts of this, and there's a real risk the climate movement begins to sort of eat itself. At the same time, everybody within that dialogue is absolutely correct in playing the roles that they play. We need to now see the big countries. China didn't step forward. They need to step forward in the next 12 months. The EU needs to go further. The US needs to go further. We can still do this, but whether or not we are going to do it is largely dependent on what happens between now and Sharm el-Sheikh in 12 months' time.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. So, wow, that's been there's a lot there from Dan and Tom. I'm going to start by going to Simon, maybe, to see, Simon, what would be your reflections on what you heard? What would be your perspective? And yeah, how was COP26 for you? Where does it leave us?
Well, okay, thank you. And thanks, Tom and Dan. Very, very interesting talks. And I'm full of questions. I'm struggling to know which to ask first. I think I'm not going to give a big reflection of my own on this. I think I'd rather that these two chaps who know so much do the talking. I've got a few questions. Perhaps I can just ask a couple now. Tom, you mentioned the ratchet mechanism. As it gets tighter, I mean, it has been very successful up to now in tightening up, but as it gets tighter, it's pushing up against powerful interests who are starting to feel a more ready threat to their power and their wealth. Do we not have a problem here that we're going to meet resistance and we're going to see a slowing of that process, because we don't have an infinite amount of time to wait for this to work, as we're getting to the point, as Dan showed with his graph that was increasing gradient, that we're nearing a vertical, or not quite, but we're nearing, it's a very precipitous drop. Has there been any discussion in the Blue Room at COP about moving towards a more legally binding framework? Because at the moment each country can make these pledges. I mean, the UK has made a pledge for 2030, which in 68% drop on 1990 levels, which is 45% drop on 2018. That's, cutting almost half our emissions from a few years ago, and closing, sorry, this is a long question, closing, we'd have to close around half our gas power stations. There's no sign of that happening. In fact, there's sign of more gas power stations being built. Has there been any talk about moving towards making these commitments legally binding? And if not, do you think there's perhaps a role for a country like the UK that led the way into the Industrial Revolution to lead the way out by unilaterally showing leadership and introducing a legally binding mechanism itself domestically?
I think thank you, Simon. I think what we might do is hear from all four of our discussants, and we'll sort of put the questions in a little pile, and then we'll hear from Tom and Dan in response to those questions. So, Tom, have you got what that question was?
Yeah, got it. Yeah.
Beautiful, great. And Simon, you said you had a second question, or were they both rolled into that one?
Well, I've got lots. Which to go with? Let's talk about carbon budgets. One concern we have, sort of looking from the outside, is that you know, it's all very well talking about 2050, and policymakers seem to be very fixated on looking at this single data point or a 2030 commitment. But the warming is proportional to the total amount of carbon we put into the atmosphere. That's the sort of path we were supposed to take back in 2018, or was it 20? Have I updated it? It's mirror imaged for me, so I can't read it. The danger is, as we focus on 2050 and just defer the difficult decisions, we carry on seeing increased emissions. And even if we brought emissions into zero by 2050, you can see that those two pathways are very different, and we can burn an awful lot more carbon while still praising ourselves and patting each other on the back that we're going to hit 2050. Is there any prospect of a move towards, instead of single commitments for single data point, 2030 reduction, to actually ask each country to submit its carbon budgets, so we can properly add everything up and check that we don't breach 1.5.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. So questions logged, and Chantal, over to you. What would be your reflections or questions or thoughts?
Okay, thanks. They were both great talks. They were very interesting. I was really struck by just some of the facts were quite heartrending, really. You know, sort of Dan talked about 250,000 extra deaths a year, and as someone that's worked in healthcare, I'm thinking how much morbidity sits behind that, and you know, and it's just very moving to think of you know, people losing families and friends in the Maldives, and you know, it's really kind of heartrending stuff, you know, beside all this kind of factual data. But I think what really struck me actually is it's a very physical, climate science is it's a very physical science, and it's a bit sad really that finance seems to be such an obstacle in sort of making progress, and you know, because you know, money is a human construct, and you know, so I guess it's quite a big question around sort of how I don't know how you would structure, you know, can we look at this in a different way that sort of goes beyond money, or do we need to take do we need to sort of look at the costs of not acting? You know, how do we sort of what's the opinion of the panel to how do we get over this obstacle of money? So that's one question, and one thought that really struck me, particularly from your talk, Dan. And I think another thing that struck me on a more positive note, that I think, Tom, it was really interesting to hear about the ratchet mechanism. And I'm thinking to myself, well, you know, is that something that, I mean, it seems to be having some effect. So is that something that we can use on more of a micro scale? So with my small organization, you know, if we set, you know, like short-term goals to make a longer term, do we need to all be doing that on a smaller scale for climate, sort of collectively? So can we use mechanisms like the ratchet? And I'm sort of full of admiration for Dan and the IPCC scientists for, I mean, scientists working together, it's often like herding cats. So to be able to get everyone together and get such a clear consensus is a really impressive thing. And so are there ways of working that we can take into our lives on a smaller scale to kind of make our contribution as individuals, as businesses, as countries.
Thank you, Chantal. Yeah, one of the things that was most interesting for me during COP, being in a lot of the civil society conversations outside the blue zone, was the conversations about finance and the degree to which finance was loans or whether it was grants, and that there are 30 countries in the world who pay 5 times more money in debt repayments than they're able to actually pay on climate change, and a lot of discussion about the degree to which money should be grants or should be loans. Alana, be lovely to hear from you. What would be your thoughts?
Wow. Yeah, I think just echoing Chantal, the kind of when we hear about like the facts of what's actually happening, I find that this process in myself with like dissociating from what that actually means. And I feel like you know, I was following a lot of youth activists in COP, and there was a lot of anger from young people, and I think a lot of that anger kind of comes from like, this is an emergency and the scale of this emergency is so intense, and the kind of level of action that we see doesn't kind of match that reality. And so there's this kind of traumatic thing going on where it's like, yeah, we're living in an emergency, and yet the action isn't matching that reality. So I'm kind of curious about this like severance between those on the inside and the activists that are kind of in that kind of direct action, community building space. And how do you reckon with that? I talk about trauma because I feel like it is a trauma to live with this reality. And I feel like young people are living with a lot of climate anxiety, and it's causing a lot of difficulty for young people. And like, how do you face an uncertain future? Like, what do you do? And I guess what I see with Dan and Tom, you're like, you have these amazing like political, scientific positions, and then I'm kind of curious, like, how does that intersect with community and the kind of grassroots level and the people that are kind of, you know, not in those positions of intellect and authority, but are in the kind of like, you know, how do we face into this? What can we do on this kind of community grassroots scale? So that's something that's really kind of come out. And how do we strengthen our communities? And I guess the elephant in the room for me is like, so what happens if we don't limit warming to under 2 degrees, under 1.5 degrees? Like, we're going to be seeing more and more impacts. And so what is necessary in our kind of local responses to prepare for that, and prepare for if these targets and these things don't become in place? Because I feel like that's often the elephant in the room, and I'm kind of curious how do we prepare for that uncertainty and live with that uncertainty? Those are kind of my questions all rolled up into a response.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alana. And Jackie, what would be your thoughts, your reflections, your questions?
Oh gosh, where do I start? I think the ISPCC report that came out some months ago was a fantastic sort of entree and wake up call to a lot of people. It certainly, I used it at various events to kind of quote as being, look, you know, writing's on the wall now, and this is all really sort of being very clearly laid out. And it's been so good, those reports, but this was absolutely, as Tom said, completely unequivocal. So it was a really good sort of move in towards it. Thank you both, Tom and Dan, for that really interesting kind of outline of what it was like to be there and the things that were going on and some of the kind of the senses behind the scenes, because I think that's a really important thing to have your antennae out, as well as your kind of, you know, the discussions and things going on. I was actually at Johannesburg in 2002. I was part of the Irish delegation, so I had access to everything, which was absolutely brilliant. And I mean, the sad thing is, listening to you two, it's not far off, and that's like 19 years ago, you know, and that's a scary thing, because, you know, 20 years from now we'll be, you know, into our sort of like really into the red zone, as you had it, you know, on the maps. One of the things that we did here in during COP was this COP26, and I was hosting Green Zone screenings in the Guildhall in the evening. And a couple of things that were really good at the Green Zone. One was about the One Planet, where they had the Commissioner for Future Generations speaking, and from Wales, absolutely fantastic, you know, talking about that One Planet policy they have in Wales. And also there was a thing about the tribunal for tribal people, for the indigenous peoples, and for the forests. And, you know, it just showed the breadth of what was potentially there. But my guess is that, you know, when you actually go into the kind of the, you know, the negotiations, it's basically, you know, the anonymous people in suits that are actually in there. I mean, I was shocked when I heard there was 503 fossil fuel delegates there, more than any individual country in terms of a band of people that were there lobbying. And I think that's kind of shows really where some of the, I would say even some of the, you know, the sort of what you were saying, Tom, about the breakdown of trust between the activists and the people in the room. I would say a lot of that was probably propaganda. I mean, especially since so many of the activists now are the younger generation who are having all this inflicted on them potentially. It's their future, even their sort of length of life potentially could be dramatically affected by what, you know, the older generation, I include myself there, have been sort of party to knowingly for the last 30 or 40 years. And I would say there'll be a lot of propaganda trying to sort of undermine the, you know, the activist points of view and some of the very good points and well articulated statements that I've heard from activists. So I think that's something to be really aware of. I love the maps that you showed, Dan, you know, the fat cat maps. I mean, that was just, you know, really showed up, you know, who's the winners and who's the losers, and, you know, who's responsible and who's sort of, and the mad thing is that we are all in it together. I think it's extraordinary. I've actually interestingly had somebody staying with us who's from Saudi Arabia. He's 22 and he knew nothing about COP26. He knew nothing about any of it happening. And we've had lots of discussions, and I was deeply shocked that a country that is so, you know, to potentially stands to do quite a nosedive if fossil fuels kind of big divestment happens. And so I thought that was quite worth just mentioning. In terms of the money, you know, the thing about compensation, I just wonder whether really it's the real time now for, you know, the polluter pays, which of course got thrown out in Johannesburg, but the polluter pays initiative should be back in with the carbon tax. And also, because maybe if we looked at carbon rationing, because I just wonder, how do we really engage the public? And to go back to what was said about the 250,000 estimated average loss of life directly attributable to the climate change. I mean, that's slightly, well, it's around the scale of the current COVID crisis. I mean, I think probably more than that have died across the globe in the last 12 months. But, you know, as if you average it out, I would say that, you know, that's going to be probably comparable. But we know that COVID is probably going to be just a few years as opposed to, you know, forever with the climate emergency. And I just wonder, what is, you know, my big question would be, what does it take to get that level of action on emergency in terms of those people? Because they're the same negotiators, a lot of them, including our good friend Boris, who are there, you know, party to this, talking on one hand, you know, with one group of people about COVID, another group of people about the climate emergency, and not seeing it on the same scale. In fact, it should be the reverse. You know, we should be really looking at climate emergency as such a serious matter. And, you know, just to bring it down to kind of as a, you know, a local authority representative, you know, I know that local authorities really grapple with how you convert these sort of headline figures into kind of policies. And I know that they're all kind of doing stuff on climate emergency, but when it really comes to kind of shifting things, it's almost impossible. So yeah, I suppose my questions really are about whether there's a hope for any carbon tax or carbon rationing that might really help people to get a grip on it, and whether we could even start looking at the economy maybe through the different lens of natural capital. Thank you.
Thank you. So Dan and Tom, there's quite a lot there for you to respond to and to sift through. And maybe Dan, we'll start with you. What would be your responses to some of the questions there?
Yeah, sure. So I've got a few things written down. So stop me when you want to move on to someone else. But you know, I'm not sure what order to take them in. But let me start off with Alana's question, maybe, because you were talking about climate anxiety and you know, the way that young people are feeling very disenfranchised and scared. You know, I have young nieces myself, one of whom has serious climate anxiety that is affecting her, affecting her mental health effectively. So it's something that I'm very aware of, and it really reminds me of my my parents actually as well, because they grew up in an era of where they were my mom especially was extremely worried about nuclear Armageddon. She grew up at a time where she was terrified every time a plane went over. And I think what it is, it's that sense of fear without any power, without any sense of agency to actually be able to do anything about that thing. And that's what it is with climate change, because it's a global problem where the impact, where as an individual, it can feel sometimes that you don't have the control. And I think the analogy with sort of nuclear war is the same. Is the same thing. But I think in terms of climate change, there are some, what I've found when talking to people, and for myself as well, I think that with climate change, there are things that we can do on an individual level, and by doing those things in our own life, I think you regain that sense of agency and that sense of power. And by making changes in our own lives and at a personal level, in my experience, I've found with others and with myself that it takes away some of that climate anxiety, because it gives you a sense of, it gives you back that sense of control. Simon talked about, he showed some graphs flashing up about different emission scenarios, and I think that is sort of taking into account in the Paris Agreement, in that we have a temperature target, not a emission, a certain emissions target or amount of carbon per year. The actual Paris Agreement is what is enshrined as a temperature target. And then combined with the ratchet mechanism and the fact that now as scientists we can monitor what is happening, not only people's commitments, but the year on year, actually how temperature is changing. I think we do have that, we can do that monitoring. So I think that is something that, and so countries can be held to account in that way. And there is a mechanism by which you can come down a different, your emissions can come down a different scenario. Jackie talked about the carbon rationing and how we can get this sense of urgency into policymakers. And I think the issue, and the sort of the difference between the response to COVID versus the response to climate change in this country, for example, or maybe this country is not a very good example, but let's some other countries where the response to climate change is very poor, whereas the response to COVID has been very strong. And I think the issue there is clear. It is that it's the people who vote in those countries are not immediately or don't feel that they're immediately directly affected by climate change or aren't as concerned about that. And politicians are basically ruled by their voters. And so I think that's the issue. But what it means, therefore, that what we as citizens need to do is to make it clear, is to vote in such a way that means that politicians do become more concerned about climate. And we as citizens, if we vote in a particular way, and if we discuss issues with our fellow citizens, encourage them to do the same, that in a democracy, that's how things change.
Great. Thank you, Dan. Tom, what would be your responses to that?
Sure. No, that was a great answer from Dan. So I'll just pick a couple. So Simon talked about legally binding targets. I mean, on one level, I completely agree with you, and all targets should be both nationally and internationally legally binding. The problem is that if you look back historically, there's no global government by which they get implemented. So the Kyoto Protocol was very difficult to negotiate. It was legally binding, shared commitments from the developed countries. Canada was not going to meet its obligation. And so rather than pay the fine, the day before they were due to pay the fine, they simply pulled out of the agreement. So in a world where you don't have any overarching global governance mechanism, you just need to think about what's practical. It feels like it would be great to have the imprimatur of being legally binding, but the truth is, it's all carrot and no stick on the global stage, right? I mean, it can be some stick behind closed doors when it's based on other things to do with trade or other bilateral relationships. But you can't force sovereign countries to do something. You have to show them that it's in their national interest, has been my experience. A great question from Chantal about, how do we get past this obstacle of money? I mean, it blows my mind that we're still talking about 100 billion. We agreed that in 2009, that would be 100 billion of concessional financing a year that was provided. Now, concessional is the source of enormous amounts of discussion around what exactly that means, but that we haven't gotten there so far is a really poor indicator of the level of seriousness of, for example, the United States, who are spending $780 billion a year on defense. Now, we all know why that is. It's to do with the ungovernable nature of the United States government and the fact that they can't get anything to do with climate change through the Republican Party, but nevertheless, it's crazy. We need to find a way that we see our way through that. The 100 billion, of course, ultimately is a very important totemic number, but we're not going to solve this problem with 100 billion. It shows the level of seriousness from those countries. This is actually going to be solved with trillions of dollars of financing, and the terms of that financing become very important because, as Rob pointed out, what you don't want to end up with is an accelerated debt trap. It needs to be financing in such a way that allows those countries to follow a path of their own choosing and actually to generate sufficient resources to then cover whatever cost, service whatever debt, because it's probably not all going to be grants. I think, Alana, just to go back to your point on climate grief, I think that the split that I described between those two camps, for better word, will ultimately only be healed by the demonstration of sufficient action to deal with the problem. Unless we actually see that year on year, governments and corporations and others are really taking action to drive down emissions reductions, I think this split of trust, this breakdown of trust, is now a permanent feature. And honestly, it's probably right. There's plenty of good reason for that breakdown of trust, but it's going to be a different strategy for those of us who care about this issue, to work out how do we still partner in effective ways between the individuals that span both sides of that discussion. And then, Jackie, I thought you made a great point about lobbying. Now, just one interesting element about that report. That report was outrageous and also demonstrates the challenge inside the negotiations, but it was also slightly duplicitous. So if you dig into that report, they claim that anyone that represents a trade association that has even one fossil fuel member was there as a representative of the fossil fuel industry. Now, in some cases, that might be the case, but if you were representing the Confederation of British Industry with 10,000 members and 400 of them are fossil fuel companies, it's not quite honest to say that that person is a fossil fuel lobbyist. So I was actually quite frustrated that it was presented like that, because it undermined trust in the process in a manner that I felt was a little bit duplicitous, but that's a broader point that we can discuss.
Great, thank you. And one of the things that is good to put that 100 billion number into perspective, I think, is the fact that the world has spent, I think it's $3.3 trillion on subsidizing the fossil fuel sector since 2015. So really 100 billion is kind of crumbs from the table. So thank you both. And what we're going to do now is we're going to move to some questions from the audience. So I'm going to ask the questions. I'll ask Dan and Tom to respond, and I'm also going to ask Chantal and Jackie and Alana and Simon that if you want to chip in, to put your hand, what's it called, not emoji, thing up anyway, yeah, put your hand, the signal up. So there's been quite a few questions around the fossil fuel oil and gas sector. So Jill says, it seems that the oil and gas industries got off nearly scot-free from COP26, and continued exploitation and extraction of oil from Western finance is continuing untrammeled in various parts of the world, with full access for fossil fuel lobbyists to the government decisions. Can you talk about oil and gas corporations and their continued industries and profit-based expansion? A lot of people said going into COP that really the only kind of good outcome from COP would have been an agreement to stop extracting oil and gas by 2030. That quite clearly didn't happen. it would be very interesting, yeah, to hear your thoughts on that, on the oil and gas sector. Did they get off scot-free, or actually, you know, like I said at the beginning, some of the things that seem to be happening, and a lot of the demonstrations that were out on the streets seem to really be pushing for the idea, and the divestment movement that Jackie alluded to earlier is really trying to remove the oil and gas sector's social license to operate. Did COP in any way actively withdraw that social license? Tom, let's start with you. And then, yeah, as I said, the invitation to Chantal, Alana, Jackie and Simon to put your hand up if you want to chip in on this as well. Tom.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I think that it's perfectly possible to argue that the oil and gas industry continues to be a major blocker in our transformation to the world we need to see, right? But just a couple of points that sit underneath that. 85% of global reserves are in the hand of national oil and gas companies. Those were the governments that were negotiating, right? I mean, when Saudi Arabia stands up on the floor of the UN and negotiates, that's also Saudi Aramco. You don't need to have Shell in the room to have an oil and gas company there. When Russia does it, it's the same. Many countries actually represent their domestic resources, and they don't want to lose the revenue that they will get from exploiting that. The other point that I would make is the way that we are seeing the credibility and the ability of oil and gas companies to operate in the economy being eroded is through the drop in profitability and the vulnerability that they therefore expose themselves to bizarrely aggressive hedge fund managers and private equity firms. I mean, these oil super majors have lost 45 to 50% of their stock value in the last 9 months. And as a result of that, tiny hedge funds like Engine Number One with 0.5% of equity can go in and win a shareholder vote and change 4 out of 12 board members of ExxonMobil. I mean, this is insane. You know, Shell and BP are now terrified of these people, that they're actually coming in and making these sorts of changes. So one of the things that I'm seeing in terms of transformation, we absolutely need to remove the social license to operate as a principle, but we also need to keep in mind the fact that most oil and gas reserves are held by national governments, and actually demand or supply will be shifted to them if we manage to drive the oil super majors out of business. But also, the reason that they're being undermined is not necessarily because of social license to operate, it's because renewables are cheaper. In 130 countries around the world now, we see wind and solar are the cheapest forms, not only of new power, but often it's cheaper to build a wind or solar plant than to run the fully costed out gas plant that is already there. So that's the transformation where the economics are beginning to work in our favor. It is still outrageous that they're exploring for new fields, and the Cambo thing was a fantastic win that actually Shell are now going to stop doing that. That was amazing. We need to keep on at that stuff, but we also need to be really thoughtful about how we can create change.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Dan.
Yeah, just to agree really very much with Tom that it almost saddens me in some ways, but it's good. It's ultimately a good thing. But the case for renewables above oil and gas and coal has not been won from an environmental argument. It is really being won from a financial argument now, in that the cost of we're at a tipping point. Now, very often you hear the word tipping point being used in climate science as a bad thing and going off at some sort of cliff edge, but there are good tipping points in our social environmental system, and one of them is related to renewable energy becoming cheaper than coal, oil, and gas. And so that, as exactly as Tom says, the investors will speak. And it's I'm going way outside my area of expertise here, but from what I've read about it, it sounds like that is something that's going to happen, and it's going to help this transition. And so if I was a board member on a coal, oil or gas company, I would be shit scared at the moment, because I think their future is looking dire. And so I'm far from expert, but that's from what I've read and what I've heard, that is the case. The only thing, I've lost all faith. I do have very, very little trust in the oil and gas industry, partly because very close to my field. There were in the 90s, there were oil companies that were slamming climate research in national newspapers, and were funding climate skepticism and saying how rubbish climate models were for predicting the future. At the same time as doing that, they were using the same climate models to actually help them prospect for oil in terms of making projections of past climate change. And so actually, I have very little trust for those organizations as a result of some of the things I know. And I know that's not the only reason they're untrustworthy. But anyway, yes.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Dan. An opinion I imagine shared by the majority of people on this call. Jackie, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to really give a couple of reflections because I go along to the investment and Devon Pension Fund committee meetings, and I've been pushing for divestment there because there's £5 billion in the Devon fund, and which is a lot of money. And okay, so they say, well, they're just kind of slipping it down, and now they're going to the climate change benchmark rather than the Paris alignment benchmark. So they're kind of just gradually edging towards it. But I mean, it really feels like people are just terrified to move. I mean, that seems to, I mean, even at the divestment motion that I had on county council for last Thursday, there was 8 voted in favour of it and 35 voted against it. Now, okay, they were probably all whipped, all the 35, but nevertheless, there was a few sort of non-Tories that actually voted with that as well. And I just think it seems like business as usual has got a very strong position when people feel frightened. And the guys who are kind of moving, big monies around, and these things always move a little bit slow anyway. I mean, when it first started, I started doing this, they agreed to do carbon footprint monitoring of the investments. Now, I have to say, I haven't actually seen any of the information come back yet. But what I do is I look through some of the reports that they have to kind of note at their meetings. And there's all these reports that go on about engagement. And when you actually look at the detail of how they've tried to do engagement, the response from the fossil fuel companies, in my view, actually is almost contemptuous. They don't even bother replying. So all this thing about engagement, it's like, well, where's the evidence for this sort of like the conversations? And also, it's not just about climate emergency, it's also about human rights as well as part of that engagement stuff that they're trying to talk to people about. So, it's quite a wide issue. And I think, when we look again at, the impact of fossil fuel extraction, it's not just about the climate, it's about what happens in places like Nigeria, where people's water is polluted, and all those indigenous rights. They really don't, go back to something like COP26. I think those people really don't have such a big voice at the table. I think they're, very much pushed away, and their own governments do not defend their own citizens, who are really suffering because it's just all about the big money that talks. And I think until we start seeing that big money start to become much more something people can get a real grip on, rather than it just feels weird about hedge funds and goodness knows what, because a lot of people get really lost into that, including me. I think it's really difficult, but I mean, that's where big money is supporting the wrong direction.
Thank you, Jackie. Thank you. Chantal.
Thanks. Yeah, one of the questions it raised for me was what about careers? The oil and gas industry is very dependent on, it's a highly technical type of operation, and new fields are often more difficult to extract. So can we do something around creating paths for people to transition to new careers working on green technologies? Can we defund, work on some kind of campaign to get more education in green technologies at our universities, and less education that's around oil and gas extraction? If these industries can't find the people, the technical bods to actually do it, is that a lever that could be used? And a second thought I have about it is, I'm from a grassroots project, and what we do on the ground can, it's not about individual actions, but I think sometimes it can be about scalable actions. So, for example, we looked at replacing our eco diesel van with an electric van with an equivalent payload, and it was going to cost £70,000, which is completely unaffordable for a non-profit. And we try not to do anything that isn't kind of replicable for other non-profits that are like us. And if we find a solution, we communicate that to other non-profits that work in the way that we do. So you know, we've tried to do much sort of simpler things like route planning software, you know, cutting all unnecessary journeys, better maintenance for vehicles. We're sort of looking at alternative fuels. But just to say that if there's a bit of scale, you know, if you can solve problems in small ways and scale it in some way, that can at least help people to feel that they're making some kind of contribution.
Thank you. Simon.
Yeah, thank you. I just wanted to come back on the point about renewable costs falling. I think it's worth just noting that in order to reach the net zero targets we have, we're going to have to do something like triple our electricity grid capacity as we electrify transport and heating. So my concern is that, you know, the free market now, in the time left that we have to try and reach limit warming to 1.5, isn't going to deliver that. And I know I do accept what you said on that, Tom, but my worry is that it needs strong government action now and government investment and subsidies to push it. I mean, please feel free to come back on that, but I just wanted to ask a question about negative emissions technologies, and I'll just quickly explain what I mean by that for people who haven't heard of them. So the IPCC's emission reductions pathways, on which our plans are based, have a huge reliance on these technologies like bioenergy with carbon capture and storage at Drax Power Station, which is sort of under development, to suck CO2 out of the air. You know, this is eye-wateringly expensive technology. I recently had a freedom of information request rejected, you know, asking about the cost to the taxpayer. And lots of scientists are warning that these technologies have, like, you know, bioenergy with carbon capture, direct air capture, have little chance of being ready in time and will cause huge unsustainable damage for nature. They may not even be carbon negative. You know, what's going to power the direct air, the DAX direct air with carbon capture? Would you agree with these concerns? And sorry, I should say, first of all, these assumptions of being able to suck CO2 out of the air are being used to justify not taking as much action now as we should, and to you know, permit drilling of for new oil wells and that sort of thing, because we say we're going to clear up the mess afterwards. Would you agree with the analysis that these technologies are, you know, do look worryingly sort of unworkable in the time frame? And if so, how has it happened that these assumptions have been worked into the IPCC's pathways? Is it the result of political pressure from the oil producers? And yeah, I'd just be interested in your thoughts.
Thank you, Simon. I think in the interest of keeping us so that we're responding to some questions from the audience as well, I'm going to sort of lodge that question with Tom and Dan, who could respond to it when we come to the next question. And we're going to hear from Alana, and then I'm going to ask another question. So we'll come to that in a second. Alana.
Thanks. Yeah, there's so much I want to speak to that this conversation like awakes in me, but I think I was just looking at David, food and communities. We're so divorced from circularness and connectedness, as perfectly demonstrated by nature. How on earth, no pun intended, can we adapt under a capitalist system? And I just feel like there is a lot of conversation about technology, green technology and oil and gas. And I feel like something really missing from that conversation is around food. And this like incredible technology and thing that we can leverage to actually capture carbon, put it back in the ground and back in the soil. And Chantal, you brought something about kind of developing skills and like transitioning. And, you know, we're talking about these like macro systems change that we need in order to really meet the scale of this emergency. But on that macro is also inhabited by the micro and by these small communities and by people. And I think at the macro, there is a huge shift that we need to make in terms of the way that we live and these individual actions, but then also how we how we relate to nature, how we relate to this economy, how we develop the economy, and how we develop our skills and capacities in the face of this uncertainty. And so in terms of transitioning, I feel that education, learning, land-based learning is such a key part, especially for young people. Like, young people have a huge role to play in the climate and ecological emergency. And there is like a very limited opportunities, and we're seeing rural youth kind of move out of rural environments and into cities. And actually we need those young people, because they are essentially like the workforce of a green transition. So something we're doing at the Living Projects is about that, Project Regenerate, about getting people in connection with the land, getting them to develop these kind of tangible and intangible skills around food growing, around horticulture, around regenerative land management, because so much of that is also essential. It's like they're twin tracks. We need this, you know, huge systems change, political, global, and we need these micro powerful communities that can actually change the entire culture of their local community through education, food, and learning. I just think, yeah, I don't really have a question, but I just feel it's really important to bring that into the conversation, because as a young person, I'm still young, I'm 30, but I'm still young. I feel that I can feel quite alienated from these conversations about oil and gas and green technology, and actually like the opportunities for learning is where I really find myself thriving, and where I find a lot of young people thriving and learning from each other. And yeah, I feel like that's a really key part in a transition to a circular green economy. We need better learning experiences and education.
Beautiful. Thank you, Alana, very much for speaking to that. And yeah, one of the things I was reminded of, there was a survey that was in the paper just before COP of people who worked in North Sea oil and gas, which showed that 80% of people working in the oil and gas sector in the North Sea would much rather be working in renewables. You know, it's like, actually these systems aren't working because everyone goes to work every morning with a skip in their step because they really believe in them. You know, and actually if we can create something better, people would be much happier to move across. So I'm going to move to a question by Soon 503253, not, I imagine, how her friends address her on a regular basis, but which is actually picks up on what Alana was just talking about. So Soon says, all this strengthens the case for me for our local actions, because they're a definite thing we can do within our scope of influence, work together locally, and say thank you to people like Dan and Tom for what they do at a higher scale, and of course support those efforts. But I'd love to hear from people from everybody about what's the why do local actions matter, and how do local actions, Tom, you talked about this sort of gulf between activism and between the process in the blue area, in the blue zone, and those kind of conversations. Where does the kind of activism, the kind of work that we can do at a community scale fit into that? And does it maybe have the potential to kind of bridge across that gap? Alana, maybe we'll start with you, as you were talking about this before. In what way for you does what we've heard strengthen the case for our local actions, and what does local, you know, what's the sort of extent of the possibilities of what we can do working at the local scale?
Interesting. I think in terms of the local scale, in terms of how do we leverage locality for these much bigger, like COP26, these kind of big gatherings of global leaders. I think you know, I've seen a lot of, I can only talk really from the activist point, because I feel like I've seen a lot of activists organize in incredibly fluent, collaborative ways. And I feel like collaboration is like something that I've been really inspired by in my local area, and finding like people collaborating across a lot of difference and across different worldviews. And I think that this is something, I wonder how we develop that capacity in ourselves to collaborate across difference in the face of this, because I think that, you know, Tom spoke to that around these kind of different groups of people, the kind of inside and the activists on the street. And I feel like we need each other. And I think that those bonds can be really strengthened in local community. And what if those relationships and the power and strength and trust in those relationships ripple out into these kind of bigger structural systems that are making key decisions around gas and oil and carbon. So I think, yeah, my personal experience is collaboration is like something that we actually need to develop as a skill. Yeah.
Thank you, and thank you to Jackie for pointing out that Shun is actually a man. I lived in Ireland where Shun is a woman's name, so apologies, Shun. Chantel is one of our great practitioners of local community-led action. What would be your thoughts on that?
Thanks, Rob. Yeah, I think one of the things we've already alluded to a little bit is sort of local actions matter, but they can still be powerful, both on a local level, but also they can be scalable. So if you can find a good solution that works locally, then it's got quite possible it may work somewhere else as well. And certainly that's been the case in what Food in Community does. We've connected with other food waste projects across Europe, actually, and all doing things in a slightly different way, and learning from each other. And I think local actions can actually create something of a diversity of approaches, actually. I'm a biologist, and I think having a bit of diversity in the mix, you get all sorts of different innovations, and you're more likely to hit upon solutions that work if across the world we're all trying different things. We're not all just part of one big kind of singularity. I guess the other thing about local is that it really gets the best leverage out of human relationships. So for example, yes, we gather surplus food and we give it to people that need it, but it sort of goes much beyond that, because we develop a relationship with the clients, we develop a relationship with the charities that we support, and quite often we'll start supplying a charity or an individual with food, and a relationship develops, and then they may say, I'm in a better place now, I can volunteer for you, or I can or a charity might say, oh, we might be able to collaborate on X to kind of make things better. And although this isn't directly talking about sort of the climate, this whole concept of sort of working together, and if there's a problem, we say, oh yes, I know somebody, or I know an organization that can deal with that. And it just kind of oils the wheels, and you end up with more reciprocity in the system. So I do think local is really, really important, as well as on that macro scale. But one of the ways that we've also found that is quite useful to work is to see the type of work that we do, rescuing surplus food, as being like a kind of jigsaw. So we do our thing locally, and then there's another group which does a similar thing in the neighbouring region, and we collaborate and we trade stuff. If we've got a surplus of cauliflowers and they've got a surplus of cheese, if we trade some, we can make cauliflower cheese. We're all better off. It's about human relationships and scalability, in summary.
Beautiful. Cauliflower cheese, fundamental of this, I think. Simon, one of the dreams we always had early on in Transition Town Totnes was to be able to have on the Welcome to Totnes sign, a transition town, which we've not quite managed. But I was in Staverton the other day, and I saw on your street signs as you enter Staverton, it says working towards net zero or something like that. So for which congratulations. And what would be your thoughts on this question?
Sorry, this is me with a very different hat on, working in my local parish sustainability group. You know, from there, we got together with a few other people and formed Sustainable South Hams, which is connecting groups across South Hams. And I'm a strong believer in the power of you know, enabling people with a feeling of agency that they can do something about climate change. But I think what these groups help achieve is raise awareness of the issues. That in a way it's sort of outreach, an outreach exercise to Middle England, because you find that in each new parish that forms a group, they then start to become aware of the issues, and they're talking to their friends, they're going down to the village hall, having little events. And this is how people really find out about you know, climate change, about the nature crisis, and what we all need to do. And I think from there, that leads to pressure on our politicians to change. I think I've seen a few people in the chat expressing some doubts about our ability to precipitate change through voting. And I think there's something to that. But if we can you know, build up a real popular movement and put pressure on our MPs to back real legally binding action on climate, where we link government policy to what the scientists are advising us, both on climate and on nature, then I think we can really move forwards. And I've been really excited to see that we've now got around 150 parliamentarians who are backing the bill. I say parliamentarians because it's about 118 MPs and some Lords. They're backing the Climate and Ecological Emergency Bill, which would lock policy and action to science. And then I think we could all breathe easier. We'd feel the assurance of that certainty that policy is going to deliver on the science, and we won't have to be second guessing it all the time. So yeah, I think the local action in a way is the key to, once scaled up, is the key to putting pressure on politicians and in turn driving national action. So it's sort of the tail wagging the dog. So yeah, big role for it.
Jane in the chat has just said we need more solutions targeting the poorest, like food and community, which are what we will need more than ideas which need cash to access. Enables total inclusion in terms of the solutions that we put forward. Jackie.
Sorry, couldn't find the mute button. I think, you know, you have to think about sort of things in the same way that you think about evolution, where you get sort of lots of little tiny changes, and then every now and then suddenly there's a big change, and those little changes actually contribute towards the big change. And I think a lot of that is around how we affect the culture. And I think lots of local actions, especially when it brings people together on all sorts of different things, actually just really can affect the culture. I mean, transition coming into Totnes all those years ago, really, I think it made people suddenly aware of where oil was. It wasn't just sort of in sort of cars, driving on in cars. It was actually in our food. It was in our clothing. It's in our all sorts of things that we're doing every day. And I think that sort of start broadening that understanding, you know, with people who were, very educated and informed already, but just hadn't looked at it through that lens. And I think that's what local actions do. And when they bring us together and have conversations, we start to see things through other people's eyes. Because like with Chantal, with what Alana's doing, bringing people together on sort of things like eating together or working on sort of that sort of fairly sort of stuff, easy ritual stuff, in terms of getting together and just sitting, enjoying food or sharing food, actually is the opportunity then for some of the other conversations that take place which can be really difficult otherwise, especially, at some of the sort of high power meetings. But the people who do this stuff at the local level, they are often also the big players. I mean, just because you live locally, everybody lives locally somewhere. So I think it's a real opportunity for brokering all sorts of conversations which actually lead to actually making a difference. And that was that Margaret Mead favourite sort of thing that's always quoted about, never doubt that, a few small people can make a big difference, words, I paraphrase badly, but the saying. But I think also what I think is interesting is, I was involved in what's called Local Agenda 21. That came out of 1992 Rio, the first United Nations Summit on Environment and Development. And 4 years later, John Major, the MP, the PM, famous for his grey pants. I mean, he organised a big international conference called Partnerships for Change, and it actually pushed forward this whole thing of local Agenda 21. And interestingly, when I came back to this country in 2006, I was astonished to find that local Agenda 21 had completely died. But what it actually was a really good opportunity for getting people working at the coalface together with people in local authorities, people with decision makers, with experts, all sorts of people brokering ideas and sharing resources. And I'm not surprised that it's been dropped in this country, because I think it was just too much of a good thing. I mean, there was local Agenda 21 officers in local authorities who would actually work with the local communities to help them access resources. And that was a really good formula. I mean, the group I work with, who Rob would know well as well, which is the Cork Environmental Forum, is still going from strength to strength. And it shows that if you can find ways for the community to work together across different sectors and across different levels, you actually, make people feel more empowered and more understanding of why what they do makes a difference. And I think also encourages them to go a bit further. But as I say, at the end of the day, you need cultural change to actually bring around the big changes. And I think that's what COP26 has done. It has made people feel, that those, whoever they are up there in the suits are listening. They are actually being squeezed into having to do something. And I think it feels like that change will happen, but a bit frightened to hold my breath.
Thank you. So, Tom, you mentioned before about how when you were in Paris, being able to summon up Greenpeace with some trumpets to do something that would give more pressure to what's happening inside, and big demonstrations outside and kind of direct activism sort of gives you more of a mandate within those talks. What's the role of the kind of local activism that people are talking about here, do you think, in terms of giving more kind of courage and ambition to the more kind of formal and official processes?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and I think that so I think there's lots of answers to that. I think in terms of actually taking local action and doing real things in your community to drive down emissions, I think that's essential these days for mental health. I think it's humanizing in terms of relationships. I think it's a moral requirement, given that we come from a part of the world that has produced far more emissions than most others, and it can be inspiring. And as a result of that, it can deliver a real impact on a global stage. I mean, look what you did with Transition, which originally inspired me to get into this, right? It started small, and then it went somewhere big outside of that in a way that you couldn't control. And on that, there's something I would just say about our sense of agency in the face of a big challenge. I mean, when I left Totnes in 2007 and went and worked in government and then at the UN and other places, I was astonished to discover thousands of people that would stand around looking at each other saying, oh, if only we had the power to really do something, what we'd need is people on the streets standing outside there with that. And you find that this problem, nobody feels they have the agency to solve this problem. Nobody does. Even the President of the United States is sitting there saying, I wish I could do more, but these are the problems that are in front of me. As a result of that, we all have to look at the roles that we have and what we can do. And they're all equally important, right? And ultimately, at the end of the day, we don't shift the culture. We don't do this decisively with technology. We only do it with cultural change and systems change. And that's where we're going to have to get to. And that comes bottom up, right? We also need to take the short-term steps where we are, but we're not really going to solve this problem and really do the job unless the technology change that drives down emissions is then accompanied by changes to the capitalist system, changes to the way democracy works, all these other different pieces that are at least as much part of this transformation and this transition that we're talking about. So I would say that local action, local activism is the bedrock of all of it. Without that, we would not have gotten anywhere. There's no way we would have gotten as far as we have. We need to keep pushing. We need to go further. But that's also a place that you kind of have to return to. I mean, when I get frustrated and feel dehumanized in a windowless basement in Glasgow, I put my hoodie on and go and join the march for a couple of hours. It's fantastic. And it actually brings you back into touch with real things and what people are really doing.
Dan, any thoughts on that question? We're starting to get a bit tight on time now, but if you had some thoughts.
Well, I think everyone's really covered everything that I was going to say. Just very quick, just to summarize, really very, very quickly, my own thoughts is that this, local action has three benefits at least. The first one is it has an effect on its own. Just doing that action it might be a small effect, but it has an effect. like Tom says, I think one of the most powerful parts of that is the agency it gives people and helps their mental health. But also there's this cascading effect in that by doing that, you encourage others to do the same and the next generation to do the same, and you have this knock-on effect. But then finally, I think it really can influence policymakers and influence the agenda and influence the media, and then have a broader effect. If you look at the impact, you can never run these sort of counterfactual experiments, but I would imagine that without the school strikes and the youth movement and Greta and everything that went along with that, we would not be in the position we're in now. I think we'd be in a worse position than we are now. And it just shows, the power of local action, I think.
Well, we told you that we would be finished by 9. So although the chat has been on fire and full of all kinds of fantastic, sadly, I think we're not going to get round. We'll have to do this again. So wherever you joined us on that spectrum, from it was a total waste of time to, well, maybe it was kind of as good as it could have been, wherever you started this evening on that spectrum, if you feel that you've moved one way or you've moved the other, it would be really interesting if you could just share that in the chat. It'd be interesting to get a little snapshot of how this evening has been for you. I'd like to really, really thank all of you for joining us here this evening. There's been a really, really great turnout, and yeah, shame we couldn't have done this in person, but someday soon we will. But I'd really like to thank Simon and Jackie and Alana and Chantal for being our amazing discussants. And there has been some links going into the chat where you can find out more about the Living Project, where you can find out more about food and community and about the other work that's going on. And I'd really like to thank Dan and Tom as our keynote presenters here this evening for the insight and the wisdom and the what they've brought to this this evening here. So thank you all so much. I'm going to hand back to Jim, who's just going to wrap up. But I hope you've enjoyed this evening, and we'll see you next time when we do this. Thank you.